I imagined the creature to have telescopic limbs. I tried to accomplish this effect using plastic tubes, pretty much barrels of pens, having different diameters, and inserting one into the other in succession from the largest to the thinner. I made the elbow joint using a bead. As for the claws, I knew I was going to use a tube of some sort, but I wanted something with thicker walls than a regular plastic tube. And I didn't have nothing like that. So I ended up slicing this section of thick bamboo. To make the joint mechanism, I sliced this plexiglass rod, although this is definitely not a good example of sticking to trash for my builds. Please forgive me. And then I made plenty of big rivets for my yogurt plastic pot using a hole punch. After checking again the relation between the torso and the limb, I wrapped copper wire around the end portion of the limb to add some extra detail. It will show up nicely in the painting job. Now I finally get to assemble the last one of the 4 limbs. And of course, the sections of the tail as well. I had fun adding some extra details on the model, like extra plates onto some of the joints of the tail, adding vents or exhaust pipes on the sides of the body, as well as a couple more riveted plates, also on the sides of the body. And with the eyes also put in place, I'm ready to finish the diorama. After tracing the outline of the base, I started to add some details, like the net on the back of the rock and the other one in the front, right on top of one of the roots. The idea here is that the root, growing, lifted up the net, creating a spot where all sorts of scraps gather, carried by the winds of the desolated plains. So I started filling the spot with plastic scraps from CD cases and other scrap materials lying around. I then decided to add this oil barrel from a toy to suggest the idea that men were once the inhabitants of that desolated land. I cut the barrel into uneven halves to make it look like it is half buried in the sands. I put the other half of the barrel in the back of the rock, and some other scraps from other times here and there, like these bits of plastic here that are supposed to be metal scraps resurfacing from the sands after the very harsh post-apocalyptic winds blew life away from everything that stood on their way. Now finally ready to resize the base and cover it up with this strange looking post-apocalyptic sand. Well, these are actually active carbon bits I found inside the filter of those carbon filter water jugs. I suggest you check them out if you haven't already, because they make really good textures. I then covered the surface of the base with vinyl glue and spread carbon bits on top of it, one portion of the base at a time, until I covered everything. And now I'm finally ready to paint my creature. La mia creatura, capisci? For this paint job, I'm going to use mostly acrylic paints and some washes made with oil colors and white spirits. I covered everything with a black primer. Everything but the rock and the twig. I am mixing red and yellow to obtain different tones of orange to color the sand. I would like the color of the sand to be quite unusual. Actually, what I imagine I'm painting here is a mixture of sand and debris of all sorts, by then reduced to small particles as thin as grains, mixed together in a post-apocalyptic Mars reddish terrain. I then take care of the metal details, that is the barrels, the metal scraps and the nets, laying on them some dark silver paint. And here I'm using Games Workshop Lead Belcher. At a later time I will highlight them with silver and create a rusty texture on some parts of them. My idea here is to use a copper brass looking paint for the main portion of the body and a silver color to paint all the parts that I imagine be made of a much harder metal or alloy, like the plates, horn and dewlap, the claws, and the spikes at the end of the tail, but also the joints and some other details here and there. Here I use a flat brush with a little bit of silver paint, paying much attention not to smear any paint into the grooves. I really hope that a proper use of the washes will do much of the remaining job, blending together the two main metal colors nicely. Here I use Rayclan Flash Shade from Games Workshop to wash over the brass parts, and Null Oil Wash, also from Games Workshop, to wash over the steel parts and the joints. In the meantime, I also managed to break the creature's tail in two halves. But you know what? Let's look at the bright side of it. This actually makes painting much easier. Eventually, I decided not to use Games Workshop's Null Oil. Instead, I made me some homemade wash using black oil painting and white spirit, that in Italy we call acquaraggia di pino. I couldn't resist. I just couldn't resist. I am a huge fan of this kind of washes made with oil painting. They are so bright and you can give it the consistency you like. Here I use a cotton bud to smoothen out the transition between the black ink and the silver paint. It is now time for the finishing touches. I try to smoothen out the stains left by the black wash also on the bony plates. Let's also highlight some details here and there. And that's pretty much it. Let's now watch the results.